Dinner and a relaxing evening with the new couple next door were the only plans. A couple of wine glasses, some before leaving for home, there might be some board games and some fun. But as soon as I noticed how their gazes remained on us rather than on one another, I realized that this was more than just being neighborly. I was unable to identify the charge that was in the air, a mixture of inquisitiveness and something more substantial, awaiting recognition. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to this video before I reveal what actually transpired that evening. It's fast. You won't believe how much it helps, and believe me, you'll want to see this through to the very finish. More than the invitation itself, I can still hear the cork popping. We were at home in our pajamas in a moment. The next day, we pretended it was just another peaceful evening in the neighborhood as we crossed the driveway holding a bottle of wine and smiling politely. However, something about it appeared contrived, as if there was a scene all set up for us as I stood at their door and watched the glow flow from inside. Their home was cozy in the ideal magazine fashion. On the coffee table, candles burned next to a game of half-set. The faint buzz of music blended with the aroma of butter and rosemary as it floated through the air. Mark was the first to open the door, rolling his sleeves, grinning easily and practicing. Behind him, Leia emerged, glowing in a silk shirt that glistened in every ray of sunlight. She made hosting seem so easy that she waved the bottle away when we gave it to her. She said, "You didn't have to bring anything," but her gaze stayed on my husband for a little while longer than her grin. The air was charged, but seemed light, as if everyone had already accepted a rule that had not been spoken out loud. Dinner went by quickly, tales, giggles, and inquiries that seemed informal but went too far. When Leia inquired about our marriage, she had a knack of seeing right through me. Her interest was sharper than it should have been, and her tone was light-hearted. Mark repeatedly replenished my husband's glass. Every look is more thoughtful, every pour a little more slowly. I noticed that I was adjusting my hair in their window's reflection. Not truly, not for him. At one point, I leaned across the table to brush a crumb off my sleeve just to feel noticed in a space that seemed to be made to notice. Her touch was fleeting, yet the gap it created lingered longer than it ought to have. Mark, who was across from me, observed her hand, then my response, and then grinned as if he had noticed something noteworthy. I attempted to refocus the conversation on something more commonplace. Vacations are effective. However, every silence appeared to go on for too long, and every chuckle seemed to have a deeper significance. My husband's chuckle was softer than normal when he laughed at one of Isla's jokes, as if he was attempting to hide it. Mark lowered his voice and leaned in closer to me. "She's good at getting people comfortable," he stated. I hardly had time to respond before Ela came back from the kitchen with a deck of cards, so it was difficult to discern if what he was saying was a warning or a compliment. She smiled at each of us and placed them on the table, the same smug grin from before. "Let's add some interest to this," she remarked. I then understood that dinner was never the original idea. With slow, careful movements, Leia shuffled the deck as if she had done it 1,000 times. Although nobody had said it, the room had become quieter. I could only hear the sound of cards gliding between her fingertips while the music continued to play softly in the background. With a silky voice, she said, "We'll play a question game. Pick a card. Give a truthful response or take a sip." It sounded quite innocuous. My spouse nodded while beaming, overly laid back, overly trusting. As if he knew precisely how this would go, Mark sat back in his chair and traced the lip of his glass with his gaze. The first few questions asked about humiliating childhood experiences, worst jobs, and light favorite films. When we didn't want to respond, we played along, laughed, and drank. However, the deck soon began to seem heavy, like if the following query might not be appropriate for a dinner table. Leia glanced at me and drew a card. "What have you wanted to say to someone here but haven't had a chance?" Her eyes weren't mischievous, but her tone was. She grinned as if she had anticipated my hesitation. My spouse grabbed his drink. Mark replied, "You don't have to answer unless you want to." The air became more constricted. I made a safe remark about their home, but nobody appeared to take it seriously. The following turns were looser and faster. Now that we were all leaning in, it was difficult to determine who we were laughing at because of the ways our laughter overlapped. Mark then selected a card, turned to face my husband, and declared, "It's your turn. What is something you haven't mentioned to your wife?" The question struck a different chord. Liar stopped grinning as well. My spouse turned his drink slowly in his hands while glancing down at it. He made an attempt to laugh, but it was weak. He said, "That's easy," but his voice faltered. She is already fully aware of everything. However, I could observe the silence that preceded his statement. Something he wasn't authorized to say was implied by the shadow that moved across his face. With her elbows resting on the table, Liar leaned in and said, "Are you certain now?" The room fell silent at that one question. Mark kept a close eye on him, as though he had been anticipating this. I sensed a change as the candles flickered, tiny, undetectable, and irreversible. I wasn't frozen by my husband's response when he eventually looked up. It was the way Mark grinned immediately after saying it. I realized at that moment that we were no longer playing a game. There was silence for a moment. It was now possible to sense the thickness of the air. The music appeared to disappear into the walls as well. My husband's glass was half up, and he was staring at Mark as though he was still unsure of the meaning of that smile. Liar was the first to break the quiet. Her tone was too bright. "Another round," she said. She used a practice sweep to collect the cards, but this time her hands moved more slowly. As she poured, the candlelight struck the wine, changing its color to something nearly hazardous. "You know, the best part of nights like this is finding out who's braver than they look," Mark remarked, while continuing to observe my husband. The words had stopped being playful. They landed like a challenge between us. To cover up the heat building in my chest, I took a sip. "Guess that's not me tonight," my husband said, laughing softly and uncertainly. Yayla looked across at me. Then it might be her. Despite her casual tone, it didn't seem humorous. My heart pounded more forcefully. Mark appeared to have agreed on something I hadn't heard, as he leaned back and smiled faintly. Moving to the living room, we pretended that things were still informal, with less space between chairs, more wine, and softer lighting. The shadow extended across the floor as the fire in the backdrop crackled softly. Every small sound felt amplified: the rustle of fabric, the clink of glass, the way laughter kept trailing off mid-sentence. My husband's voice was low and almost cautious as he spoke to Leia. I knew that Mark was at my side, near enough that I could sense his warmth without even looking. He said quietly, "You didn't seem surprised by any of that." I gave him a look. "By what?" "The way they looked at each other." He paused, scrutinizing my face. "Or how you gazed upon them." I started to respond, but he grinned as if he already knew the answer. The fingertips of Leia lingered longer than required as she reached out across the room to adjust my husband's collar. I should have been troubled by it. Maybe it did, but what I felt instead was something harder to name. Mark took note. "You know, it's weird." His voice was low. "How easily ease can give way to curiosity." Then I could have gotten up. I didn't. Once more, the lights became faint. I couldn't determine if it was intentional or an accident. "Maybe we should stop pretending we're not curious," Leia whispered quietly as she turned to face us, her eyes half lit. That was the final statement made before the silence took on a new form. Awkward no more, anticipating instead. And as I glanced around the room, I saw that nobody was sitting quietly where we had begun. No one moved to add another log, even though the fire had burnt low. There was no longer any music. Even though we were all still seated nearby, something had shifted. Nobody gave it a name. Nobody had to. Leia was the first to stand. She moved slowly across the room, running her hand over the top of the couch. Too low for me to hear, she paused behind my husband, bent down, and murmured something into his ear. He remained silent about whatever it was. He didn't look at me, he just let out a low, uncertain breath and put his glass down. Mark moved closer across from them. I sensed the change in the air before I felt his touch, but not abruptly or violently. He didn't seize me, he didn't inquire. His fingertips touched my wrist gently, right where my pulse was. I didn't back down. I ought to have. Slowly, his hand followed the curve of my arm to my shoulder, where my dress's fabric had shifted just a bit. He hesitated long enough for me to notice, then made a slight adjustment that seemed almost like he was correcting it, but he wasn't. He waited. My spouse hadn't given me a glance yet. With one hand behind his neck and the other resting on his chest as if she had always belonged there, Laya was in his lap with her legs neatly curled over his. Mark spoke softly. "You okay?" I nodded, but it was only a reaction rather than a thinking. He leaned closer till I could feel his breath curling low in my chest like smoke, not just on my neck, but inside it as well. Slower this time, his fingers moved down my arm till they found my hand and drew it in his direction. He didn't give me a kiss. Not quite yet. He merely kept my gaze, his thumb sliding in little circles across my hand, like he was testing how far I'd let him go. He was not stopped by me. As I leaned in his direction, the couch moved, and Laya looked over at the sound. When she realized where we were, she grinned. Nor shocked, nor arrogant, but content, as if this had always been planned. Mark leaned forward to be nearer, but not to whisper. Just enough to feel the fabric between us shift, his hand slipped to my back without being low or possessive. He sensed my sharp inhalation. Instead of moving against me, he moved with me. He turned when I did. He waited as I paused. His breath caught when I eventually closed the distance between us. From the other side of the room, I heard a faint sound. Not my. I didn't check. I didn't have to. His lips were never firmly in contact with mine. It was slower than that. Slower than I thought. Like he wanted to explore how much tension could live between two individuals before it broke. My hand grabbed his shirt, not to pull him closer, but just to hold something. The cotton was warm against my fingers. I felt the pattern of his breathing there, steady and close. Behind me, the fire crackled. I felt the heat of it on my back. Mark's hands were moving slowly, patiently, and never hurriedly along my sides in front of me, as if he was aware of how long this had been going on. I eventually got to my feet, or perhaps he lifted me up. I can't recall. The pace of everything caused the room to get slightly blurry, not because of the wine. The feeling that we were falling without tilting and moving without walking. His hands were on my waist as he pressed into me, guiding but never holding. My back struck the wall, or perhaps the window's edge. As his lips contacted my neck, I felt a chilly sensation on my shoulder. Intentionally, not urgently. His jacket, my straps, and my fingers all traced the location of garments that had been there a second before. Nothing has been said yet. Nobody interjected yet. Something sounded behind us. A whisper, a sigh, perhaps my name. I turned a little and I briefly saw them. Laya had her back to us. Behind her, still partially clothed, my husband's eyes were fixed on me rather than her, and he did nothing to stop it. Mark didn't flinch when he noticed where I was staring. He held me in his hand. I glanced back to him as my breath became more rapid. Want was no longer the only factor. It had to do with the fact that nothing was being stopped. Slowly, the room whirled, not in anarchy, but in submission. Each sound built upon the one before it, wood against glass, skin brushing fabric, breathing that was no longer unique to one individual. We didn't trade places. Not entirely. However, the boundaries between us became so thin that they may as well have vanished. Mark gave me another, more intense kiss. With my hands following the contours of his back through his shirt, I drew him in closer. I could feel every breath he took, every change in his weight, and every instance in which I had the option to stop, but chose not to. Somewhere behind me, my spouse let out a breath. I didn't look back again. I didn't have to. There was no mayhem. It involved choreography, and we sat in silence as the fire eventually subsided into glowing embers, and the only noises were our own breathing. It's the kind of silence that follows something you know you won't discuss again, not guilt or remorse. Nobody mentioned anything by morning. Not in the kitchen, not at the door, not even as we silently and empty-handedly traversed the driveway. But all four of us were aware that something had changed. We continue to wave, we continue to smile. However, each time I watch their curtains move, I question whether they are also recalling it. Tell the truth. Would you have remained or left if your neighbours had welcomed you over in that manner? Let me know in the comments. I'm going to read. To ensure you don't miss the next one, please like the video, subscribe, and enable notifications before you leave. I appreciate you being here. I'll see you shortly, everybody.